Hi, welcome to the second movie of the month gathering. And I'm here with the amazing Allan Kaplan to talk about the film Selma.
Hi, everyone. I guess I will start off with a couple things. First, it really helps me to always start with saying that as I'm talking, I may stutter because I am a stutterer. I was really bad as a child, but I've gotten better. So you will maybe experience that. And I am putting myself out there. I've been cloistered in academia and writing and doing all my research, but because of what's happening in the world, I'm putting myself out there. So I'm working through my limitations to try to share with you the wisdom that has been shared with me and all that I've discovered.
We are so grateful.
All right. So I want to start with a little kind of meditation, perceptual practice for us to help prepare our palate for the conversation. So if we can get comfortable and close our eyes and focus on our breathing for a moment. Just being aware of our breath. I call on us to bring our awareness to our conscious field. Just that space where we are now hearing my voice in this space and perhaps hearing the sounds around you, feeling your body where you are, and any sounds around you and any feelings you have in your body, your thoughts, all your awareness, that's all part of your conscious field, our conscious field. And I want us to kind of hold it in a way, just try to feel how this conscious field has been shaped by our entire lives. The station in life that we were born into, were we born in rich or poor, middle class, our families in a majority position in the culture and society, or are they in a minority position? Are we and our families and the generations, will be part of people who have been oppressed, who felt injustices? And if we weren't, all of those have shaped our lives, and try to feel into that, how these different collective fields that we were a part of shaped how we perceive ourselves, each other, and the world. So in a way, try to feel this, your conscious field, as like it's been constructed. We call this a construct field. And we all have our construct fields. And often when we try to raise consciousness in others or in ourselves, we have to find a way to transcend these construct fields and move beyond them. And so let's just call on us to be open and aware that Selma, the film we saw, and a lot of the films from the group that Ava DuVernay was a part of and is a part of, they are trying to transcend our collective construct field around race and expose the structural, cultural, and social constructs that separate us. And if we bring ourselves back, focus on our breath again for a moment, and open our eyes when we feel called to. So here we are, speaking through construct fields, trying to explore how we try and strive to transcend them within ourselves and each other. And the work that this group is doing is, I think, beautiful, especially at this time. So I really wanted to talk about that just real quick and just give us a basic kind of overview of what is the power, what's going on here in terms of consciousness, in the consciousness raising. So starting maybe 5 to 10 years ago, it feels like sometime during the Obama administration, I think it had a profound impact on what has been happening in African American cinema. We see a big shift in just this freedom of expression, and they're advancing into this different way of speaking to us about race. And it is, they're using complex communication. They're kind of trying to unpack the experience of people of color from the deeply personal, the interpersonal, the objective on the ground facts, and the social and systemic structures that support that and keep that going. And they tap into the personal to kind of connect us with the characters, and then they try to bring us into their world and have us viscerally feel what's going on. And so you'll notice in Selma is a great example of this, where if you think of other films that tried to capture big social movements and big events like that, they're often from an external perspective. You know, like you see Gandhi, if you watch Gandhi, it's like, you know, all the actions he took, everything that went on and all that. But here in Selma, you get Martin Luther King's personal struggles and life, his relationships with his family and with everyone who he's working with and trying to support. And we actually see his consciousness. We see his intentions that explores what he was trying to do in a deep way. So we learn that he was a big picture thinker. I mean, we learned that he was actually thinking about how do we raise white consciousness? How do we make people really aware, really conscious of what's going on? And how to use the system, how to use, you know, so it's like, you know, so it's really quite beautiful and brilliant. And I think it takes him and makes him human, because we have so much of what we have been told and hold about him is kind of iconic. And he's this big figure, you know. But it really kind of gives us the the personal, but also what he was trying to do. And in that, we have this beautiful kind of blueprint for how do we use media on a mass scale to raise consciousness. There's this great, beautiful scene, beautiful in terms of cinematically, not beautiful in terms of humanly. All right, so on the bridge, and Martin Luther King is in the church with his team watching on television, and the people are on the bridge, and there's an attack on them, and it's going on the news. And we are intercutting between what's happening on the ground, what's happening in the church with them watching what's going on, and then what's happening with how that is being broadcast. And we're going and seeing white viewers across the country, like looking. And this is a powerful wake-up moment. We're actually observing people waking up. They're showing it. And it's just, I think that's amazing and beautiful, and it's very powerful to me. And so that's this beautiful kind of power that this approach that they're doing has, that they're trying to unpack the whole thing, root it in the personal, but give us the big picture through the personal. So it's brilliant. She does it often and a lot, and so does many other filmmakers, which I will put out a list of some of the filmmakers in this collective effort. And then there's one more thing real quick before we open it up. One of the other things that Ava DuVernay is particularly focused on, and particularly doing amazing advanced work in terms of African American cinema, but all cinema. She is synthesizing masculine and feminine approaches to cinematic storytelling. And this is, I think, major, what she's doing here. And that is, first of all, I learned about this from one of the great groundbreaking women filmmakers in Hollywood anyways, Lynn Littman. She's director of Testament. She spoke to our class. Basically, she told us that, and I was a young, film student or whatever, and I didn't at that time understand psychology and consciousness yet, that stuff. She was telling us that there's a masculine and feminine approach, a way of perceiving the world and a way of operating in the world and a way of expressing themselves. And she kind of basically went into it and said, now this is not male and female. This is masculine and feminine, which we all have masculine and feminine in us. And we tend to have one stronger than the other. Now, traditionally, most women have the higher feminine and most men have the higher masculine. But that's just a stereotype, and that's necessarily true. There's a lot of men who have the feminine energy and a lot of women who has a lot of masculine energy. So, but for the masculine, it's linear storytelling and action oriented. The feminine is nonlinear and communion oriented, relationship oriented. And we have these stereotypes of, oh, that's just a chick flick, or that's a guy film. And it's actually rooted in this but it mistakes that it's women films and men films. It's masculine oriented or feminine oriented. And there's some pretty good research that there is this psychological makeup, and there's this great research on moral development, where people with higher masculine and people with higher feminine evolve through the stages of moral development differently. And they discovered that it is that the masculine is agency oriented and the feminine is communion oriented. So for example, in the evolution of our moral development, we expand our circles of care and concern from just ourselves to our group, to our country, to our, our people, to the world, to all of humanity, to all of sentient form. But people with high masculine will be like, okay, how do I fix it if it's off? What do I do to fix this? And the feminine is, how do I connect with this? How do I feel what's going on? How do I understand what's going on? And so she was talking about how, and she used this great example of, if you notice people with high feminine, when they're cleaning a house, they'll clean one area, and then they'll just pop over to another area, and then they'll go to another area, and it often won't look systematic. Whereas people with high masculine will be like, do this first, do that second, do that, And so when we get our stories, we'll get these, the driving force of a story is often either agency oriented or communion oriented. So you'll get so for example, a normal action film will have, event after event, and the action's unfolding, and it's oriented towards the action. Whereas a feminine-oriented film will first have the relationships and have, focus on that as like, what's the driving force of everything? And what DuVernay is doing is she is taking an event, starting with the relationships, then going into the action of the event, and then as the action is happening, she's unpacking the relational processes in that. And there's often in her stuff, there's this moment where she'll open the action and pull us in to the feeling field of what's going on. And then we would go out of the, So she's kind of playing with the structure and kind of like going back and forth between the forces of agency and communion, and using each to feed off of each other in kind of this beautiful, kind of dynamic, spiraling process. And it's very subtle in Selma, but it is definitely there. In some of her other films, it's more overt. But this is a beautiful thing that she's doing, and I just wanted to call our attention to it, because if you're a filmmaker, conscious filmmaker, and you're trying to raise consciousness, this is important to understand that this affects how we communicate across fields of consciousness, how we connect with people. And if you're doing this kind of synergy of masculine and feminine, you're going to connect with more people. So I believe that for conscious filmmakers, studying what she's doing is important because that can help us find that synergy and really think about that. And for us viewers who just watch it to recognize how we're kind of what we're drawn to, what our preferences are, and see if we could play with that a little bit and open up those constructs a little bit and maybe help it using that awareness to maybe find in ourselves, think about how can we balance it and be more conscious of the masculine and feminine inside of us. And we can use watching these films as a way of working with that. So
beautiful, Mark. Beautiful. I love that.
thank you. So any thoughts, reflections,
Well,
or
if we're going to delve into the interactive portion, I would love to know other filmmakers that you feel are blending this masculine and feminine effectively in their work. Are there other filmmakers you could recommend that we view and watch? You can always email the Creators Network after if you want to give that some thought.
Yeah, let me think about that a little bit. Yeah, she's pushing the envelope. I don't know anybody who's going as far as she's going. I'm aware that, I mean, there is actually, now that we're talking about it, something rose in my awareness. There's a film called Source Code. And that also is a film that is trying to create that synergy. There's also a film called The Season. And it's a beautiful work that twists it all inside and out, because what it does is it plays with the masculine and feminine and also the text and subtext levels of story. So it'll kind of take us to the outside of a situation and then to the inside, back and forth. So we get this kind of objective view, observing events, action orientation, and then the whole scene will kind of shift into this communion field. So it's kind of this really fascinating process. And I'll think of some more that I could post.
Well, what's coming to me, which is so fascinating from hearing you speak, and again, so much gratitude for this perspective and the studies, obviously, that you've done with film. What's coming to me is, we have an issue in Hollywood or in visual filmmaking, visual storytelling, of too few female directors, right? It's like, we need more female directors, more and more and more. And I had always attributed it to the idea that, from a very young age, we are conditioned to have certain expectations of our lives. And what's fascinating is, and of course, even today, I'm reminded that, most, entrepreneurs, solopreneurs are not female, certainly not the ones getting VC funding. But so I'm always attributing it to external factors, just the constant repetition of, why do you think you could do that? But what I'm hearing is, if this is the majority of storytelling, the approach to visual storytelling that we've seen primarily to date, and this is not a strong feminine approach to visual storytelling, that might also be something to discourage, the feminine or more of the females from getting in, because there's the way that they would tell a story does not conform to the ways that storytelling has been, visual stories have been told. So that is another, probably could be a reason why there's this hesitation to jump in and say, I'm going to direct a film.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I hadn't thought about that, but that would make sense. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I would love to talk a bit about just the significance of this story, and just what an incredible, as you said, personal revelation of what this man, who we have seen as an icon, what it took for him to move the civil rights movement forward. And that in itself, just this aspect of the story, focusing in on Selma and this march and what that meant to get Johnson to wake up, right? Can you talk a bit about the significance from a historical perspective and race relations?
Yeah. And it's what's interesting is it really kind of captures the layering of consciousness fields. So you have individual prejudice in the consciousness of some people. And then you have groups of people who are prejudiced. And then you have collective, fields of people who are unconscious of this and all that. And then you have politics and you have the president. And it's like, we see how it's like he's in this field of, he's in this systemic construct field of, well, he's got to balance everything. And, he's like just seeing everything from his perspective. And he's not grokking. And I use this word a lot. And so it's like, he's not fully feeling in his whole being what they're going through.
Clearly not.
Yeah. And he really thinks he's helping. And he really thinks that they're just asking too much, that it could be, we just have to wait a while and all that. And Martin Luther King said something I want to say real quick. One of the people who just logged on is Jonathan Steigman, who helped me with this research, who was vital in a lot of this, who did a lot of the data collection and stuff. So,
hello.
Hey, Jonathan.
I can't figure out how to get my camera on Bropra, but oh well.
Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. And thank you for working with Mark on this really incredibly rich, important film and the context.
Oh yeah, he's my teacher.
We learn from each other. We all learn from each other, right? So anyway, Jonathan, this is one of the things we've talked about is that, what was that quote from Martin Luther King?
He said the biggest obstacle standing in the way of Black freedom and liberty is not the white redneck sheriff or the KKKer. It's the white moderate who says, we agree with you, we want you to be free, but it's just not the right time. So he says they're willing to negotiate another man's freedom on their own timetable. That's from his letter from the burning Birmingham jail.
Cool, man. So,
yeah,
that's powerful. And it rings so true.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've kind of been going back and forth with this book, White Fragility, which is all about that, how hard it is for white people to talk about racism, especially the woman who wrote it is a white academic, a liberal academic. And she says, I think white liberals do the most daily damage to people of color because they think they're progressive and yet they don't really see Black people as our brothers and sisters, literally, So they allow things.
This is an important point, is in a way, it's easier to see the extreme prejudice up front. It's really hard for us that have grown up in a system that is, it's integrated into the system itself. into the society that we're born in and we raised in. So it's part of our construct still. So often it's very hard for us, non-people of color, to actually face it in ourselves, because it is unconscious inside of us. And this is one of the beautiful things about what Ava is doing and this group of filmmakers, is they are actually trying to bypass our defense mechanisms, because often, you know, a lot of the previous works about racism have been kind of like a frontal assault on us, that, you know, it's here, it's racism, and it, you know, and it will shut down, you know, like
and we just, that white guilt, right? And we shut down.
Boom. And so instead of that, what they're doing is they're taking us into these characters, deeply personal, and we're getting to feel what it's like to be them in our world. So that's what they're kind of letting us go inside of their reality and letting us feel what it's like to be where they are. And that's a big, huge shift. And this is really, I think, vital for us conscious filmmakers and us conscious consumers of media, you know, to really kind of understand this, you know, this is a real, how do we raise consciousness around an issue that has like this defense mechanism or cognitive dissonance happening? An example is, how do we reach people who are in denial over climate change? So that
Exactly.
that has a lot of cognitive dissonance, a lot of denial, and there's a lot of problems happening there, because a lot of the people in denial are at a stage of development that actually cannot fully perceive it. So there, if we're a conscious filmmaker trying to communicate about global warming and break through that barrier, we got to find a way to transcend that. And so this group, somehow, either consciously or unconsciously, they are going over the radar and under the radar. So we observed this in our research, in that we saw they'll either take the experience to like this absurdist level, like in Get Out, a recent film, or Sorry to Bother You. I don't know if anyone has seen those, but they're African. They're part of this new movement of African American cinema, and they're like really kind of satire, absurd, over the top, you know, looking at it. And then there are these works which just takes us deep inside and underneath.
Even from the title, Selma, right? You know, it's a place and a point in time that had incredible significance, but it's approachable, right? It's not the biopic of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
So, so the one thing I wanted to talk about was my overall reaction from watching this film was one of, I can't believe it's 40 years later and we really haven't progressed that far. We still need movements like Black Lives Matter. I mean, we still need to work on having, you know, doing voter suppression, you know, in the South especially. And that feeling of, oh my gosh, are we ever going to be at a point where we can say we are living truly as one?
This brings up, I think, a really important kind of big picture kind of understanding of the evolution of consciousness and all this stuff that we've been talking about. That is, what we're dealing with is a fundamental issue in consciousness of how human beings have othered each other. And this is deep. This is deep in the world of duality. And in most of the early stages of development, we are actually first we construct this otherness, which is when we're born, we have no sense of any kind of separation of anything, even us being separate from what we're seeing. And then we kind of get that, oh, I'm here and this other being who's feeding me and loving me is someone outside of me. So fundamental to our existence in this world of form is this duality. But as we evolve, we tend to expand our circles of care and concern and start to do that. So when we're dealing with a major othering issue like racism or prejudice, we're dealing with layers of this othering. And it's a fundamental kind of part of our world that we have to struggle with and against as we evolve. And one of the important issues that's happening right now, and I think this movement in African American cinema is part of this, which is what's happening in the world right now, from this perspective, is that we are being called to let go of our othering for the first time in human history. That this transformation we're facing, this evolutionary shift that we're facing, why we have the rise of authoritarianism, we're facing these global scale crises, and this is about us shifting from a nation-centric to a global-centric reality. And to do that, we have to transcend our othering of each other. I'm an American, you're not. I'm black, you're white, or you're black, all of this is coming to the forefront. And I believe this movement is part of that, and it's helping us all kind of try to transcend the otherness happening between white or non-people of color and people of color. And I think we have the rise of hatred, in one swirling area of our collective field. And we also have this other rising, people trying to transcend that othering. And I think this rising of the other, of the hatred, of the prejudice, is pulling up our shadow, our collective shadow, in the way the election of Trump is like bringing our shadow out in the open for us to finally deal with it. And I think what this group of filmmakers is doing is giving us a great blueprint for how to work with that, how to transcend it. And I think, in a way, the African American struggle is kind of coming to a peak right now, and they're finding a way to share this across the boundaries right now, and because it's perfect time for it. This is it. This is like, in a way, what Obama often talked about and Martin Luther King talked about too, and all that. I think Obama was referring to Martin Luther King, actually. That the process is a long journey, and that each generation is fighting. It's like, and I think in this film, Martin Luther King even says, these are not separate things that we've achieved, that we've gotten, they've handled segregation and all that. And so, and he was saying we could think, but why hasn't it changed yet? And, he was saying something to the effect that, this is one long journey. And so in a way, if we look at this arc of both, now I have to say I'm a white person, so there's a lot I don't know about the African American experience and journey. And even watching these films, if you're not a person of color, there's things we can never kind of fully grok that's being communicated within their own culture. But they are trying to transcend that and communicate that. So anyway, but basically, if you look at all that, everything we need them at this moment, and we have them. So however evolution has been working here, with this rise of hatred and this beautiful rise of these filmmakers trying to transcend it, we've got this beautiful meeting of what's happening.
Incredible. Yeah. I love that. We need them. We need them to transcend our shadow and reduce everyone's suffering in the world, really. The other part of the film that was really powerful for me, and I want to just say to everyone who's part of this group, certainly don't let me and Mark dominate. At this point, we should have everyone's participation. But the part that I felt that Ava did really well in this film is showing historically how not everyone was totally behind Martin Luther King, and there were other leaders who disagreed with the way that he was going about doing things. And so it wasn't just, having the support of his wife and having support of, the people who were marching with him. It was, how do I move this all forward with Malcolm X or without Malcolm X, and this group or without that group? And it really, something that you think would be so unifying, right? That everyone, of course, is going to get behind this one man and this cause. And it's just not the case. And I think that was really poignant for me to realize that with everything, whether it's, moving the conscious media movement forward. People have different ideas of how to do that. How do we all come together and be more powerful and effective in coming together?
Absolutely. And there's that moment where the two leaders of the student group are at odds. That's a great example. And it's relational. And it's also collectively when they're talking, and this is this great moment for me in this film as it relates to conscious media, is we actually have Martin Luther King's character saying, you're about raising Black consciousness. We're here to raise white consciousness. And that's just beautiful.
Genius.
And that just really kind of shows, this blew me away. I didn't realize that Martin Luther King was that kind of a thinker, was that high up there. He was big picture, man. He was like seeing, he was seeing all dimensions at once. That just really kind of blew me away.
Say, Mark, did you talk about the scene on the Edmund Pettus Bridge already? I came in late.
Yeah, I did.
That was the thing that really kind of blew me away, that the celebratory quality of that scene, even as they were being beaten up, because they were doing it knowingly and in order to show what they were.
That's a great point that I did not get. Okay.
Through their eyes,
Yeah, this is a great point. We look at that scene, and it's this, at the end, we feel uplifted because we see this event of suffering but it's framed as like these people were there to kind of give their bodies to the cause and like and
Right.
show the hatred in existence to the rest of the world. And then seeing it affect them, to seeing it wake people up, it gives this moment, this kind of uplifting kind of like, whoa, like, a celebratory, as Jonathan said, you get this celebratory experience. It's just amazing.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Beautiful. I also loved talking about the scenes on the bridge. When it's that time when Martin Luther comes and he kneels down and prays, right? And then he just stands up and turns around and goes through the crowd, and everyone is like, what's he doing? And that line where he said, I would rather these people hate me and say awful things about me because I turned around than having their lives on my conscience. They're incredible.
And then later, the white priest was talking to another white priest and saying, I so respect what he did. And I mean, paraphrasing, that he respected what he did because he trusted God. He prayed for guidance. He got it. And even though it was against what everyone thought, he was brave enough.
It was a great setup for that scene, right? Right. The conversation right before they're attacked. Yeah. So well done.
Magnificent. So anything else, Jonathan, you want to bring up?
Well, I'm sure you talked about communion and communion storytelling and how Ava uses that in this film too. Even when she's dealing with men or women, there's always aspects of relationships, even with him and his wife, and the tension there, but they're just human beings, so
yeah
does a great job with that. There are a lot of nice moments between people in here. As you say, the scene with the students was kind of an interesting, or the two different groups, one of them wants to be more radical, one of them's more into peace. And that's sort of reflected even today, It made me think there's a good documentary on Netflix about this guy who's a black musician in Baltimore who goes and meets with KKK people, and he tries to make friends with these white supremacists, and he's actually gotten like 20 people to give up their robes and become not white supremacists anymore. And yet he had a meeting with some Black Lives Matter people, and they were just absolutely just terribly disgusted that he was meeting these people, and like, they're the enemy, and he's like, you have to meet the enemy. And I always just quote that MLK line about how you can't defeat your enemies with hate, only love can do that. So that's very much part of his bringing that quality into it, and we could use more of that today. I think there's a lot of hatred and anger on both sides.
Yes.
As a tactician, it's just a better tactic too. Nonviolence is a better tactic. That was what MLK said. A lot of other people said as well.
That's a great point, and that's what they're trying to capture here. It's the power of that, and even to the point. Oh, there she is. You're showing Ava, huh? We love you, Ava.
I know. Just like a little homage to Ava. I did. I had to pick up this Town and Country yesterday after I saw the film and knew we were going to be talking about her and Selma because of her new film Central Park 5.
Right, which it's actually not Central. It's When They See Us.
Oh, When They See Us. Yeah, which is an even better title.
Well, the original title was Central Park 5, and then she realized that that's the media name for them, not their name. They're not the Central Park 5. They're just 5 guys who happened to be in Central Park and got arrested and prosecuted and suffered a lot. So,
exactly.
Yeah, interesting film.
When They See Us. It's exactly what you have been talking about, Mark, in terms of getting into the emotional and putting us in that real personal experience, right?
Yes, yeah, that's the key. These filmmakers are bringing us into that personal reality.
Right. And in a way, Selma, we've talked about how Selma is actually a more Hollywood film because it is a big Hollywood production, so still follows certain rules of Hollywood. Whereas if you look at some of her other films, like Middle of Nowhere, which is a small film that she won the director prize at Sundance with, which is a fantastic film about a woman whose husband is in jail, and it's just what's the experience, what are the impacts of having a husband in jail, and he's a good guy, she's a good person. It's just a lot of stress and strain and financial stress, and how race plays into all these aspects of the court system. And just in a very subtle way, it's just a simple story, and yet it's unpacking all these different layers of the society, as you like to say, the four quadrants of integral theory: the internal, the external,
the individual and collective, internal and external. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And she's very good at showing how things affect all of those, because they're not just one thing. Whereas a typical Hollywood film will tend to just focus on one thing, like racism is bad. Oh, look, it has this impact on the society. But there's getting to the internal impacts a lot of times is harder to communicate. What is it like to just be constantly have this veneer of black skin in front of you that everywhere you go, that's the first thing people see before they see you as a human soul. They see the skin first, and then if they're liberals, they try to say, "Oh, I'm not racist at all. I don't see color." But as someone she pointed out in that book, whenever anyone says, "I don't see color," black people never think, "Oh, that's a really woke person." They think you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
You see color, you just think you don't. But
right. Well, one thing I would love to bring up before we close is I was thinking about Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah Winfrey does not need to act. And I obviously know she has a very close relationship with Ava, but I found it really intriguing, the role that she chose to play in this film, the part. And I realized how essential that scene was for us to understand the process of voter suppression. And so that I thought was really beautiful and fascinating, that she I'm sure she was able to choose whatever role she wanted in the film, in many films, and to choose that one, the unnamed, unsung, nurse who wanted to vote.
I think I remember reading an article about some of what went on behind the scenes. And I think from what I read, I think it was basically that Oprah and a lot of the big African-American actors and actresses just said, "Put me to work, whatever you want. I'm there, whatever you need from us." It was like
And I love the old footage too, where we saw in that last march, Harry Belafonte and who's the other one that we saw? Like we saw that obviously if they'd done the first march, that would really have been significant. But it was just nice how the actual footage was blended in, and it gave a lot of context for me, Sammy Davis Jr., because having seen those people in those spaces, MLK died before I was watching television, so it just really was like, yeah, okay, this happened in my lifetime.
Yeah.
Where it was hard to have that context before that, for me at least.
And I think that scene also I felt it was important too, because you realize that these people, this issue was so, that the racism was so intense and it was so important that these people who we consider famous put their lives on the line as well. They went there.
Well, that's the part that I think is so hard. There's this disconnect. We have Obama for a president, and yet, Black Lives Matter has to exist, right? You have Harry Belafonte and Sammy Davis Jr., and yet you have this whole group that can't vote. And so I think that that's really hard for white liberals to wrap their brains around, that yes, this can coexist, and here's why it coexists.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to understand that we're dealing with not just individuals, but we're dealing with a system and groupthink, and there's a lot of things that are going on in our collective consciousness field. So it's kind of like, and what Martin Luther King was recognizing was he had to move so many individual consciousnesses to shift the collective consciousness field enough so that the politicians would be forced to do something. You know, it's like, so he was kind of like looking at the systemic, you know, and so you've got the individuals putting their lives on the line to wake up individuals all across the world. And then when you get a certain number of individual minds woken, that spreads. And so that's why these major collective shifts are hard, because you're dealing with a lot of different forces, and there's a lot of structures there to keep us unwoke.
To inhibit us, to inhibit our evolution, really.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a conscious thing, because systems tend to strive for homeostasis. It's like part of the system's process is when a system evolves and comes into being, there's forces inside the system that try to keep it stable.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And while the system is fully functioning properly at the right stage of development, that homeostasis is great. But as the system reaches a point where it's no longer capable of handling the challenges around it, it will still try to hang on to the stability, even though its time is waning. So it'll keep trying to survive. And people in the system don't even realize that it's affecting them in that way. It's kind of like, Jonathan, you told me this great quote about it's very hard for people, I'm paraphrasing, it's very hard for people to do anything that puts their livelihood in jeopardy.
Yeah, that's the Sinclair Lewis quote. It's difficult for man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it.
And that's how systems work. There's a subtle pressure within a system to act and behave and perceive in a certain way. And so when we're trying to make collective change, we're dealing with those dynamics.
I would say also the system actually reacted the way it does by moving the needle on liberty for Black people, civil liberties, which enabled it to not deal with the underlying issues that Martin Luther King was actually talking about, which is probably what got him killed, because he didn't only get killed over that, he probably got killed when he started talking about the war machine, injustice, poverty, and those core issues which are inexplicably linked to white supremacy, but they're not only white supremacist issues. Their power and control issues. He started to get into those issues, and that was when he got killed. Who knows if that was the direct cause or not, but it enabled the system to then say, oh, look, we've made all this progress by passing the Civil Rights Act, and then poverty continues, and a lot of the same issues that were happening then are still going on today, the poverty and a lot of the injustice, the criminal justice system. And that happens too with Obama. There's a term for that. When you get a Black president, then everyone says, oh, look how progressive we are. We've solved the race issue because we had a Black president, and now it might be another 20 years before we have another Black president. And you can actually move backwards sometimes because you've made that little bit of progress and you feel like you've accomplished something.
Yeah, and in a way, in systems theory, there is some evidence that a experience like we had with Obama as the first African American president will naturally cause a backlash after it.
Well, yeah.
A major shift, a cultural shift that goes fast, which this was relatively big, that we had for the first time.
I thought we couldn't have Obama without George W. Like
right. Well, that's
having him, it was like he helped get Obama elected.
Yeah. But that was, I mean, in a way, if we look at it from the big picture perspective, it didn't matter what Obama did in office. I mean, it does, but at this level, having an African American president, having the persona that he had, which went totally against the white supremacist stereotype of the African American. He was brilliant, eloquent, patient. He wasn't uppity. I mean, all of these things he was the opposite of. And then this is an important point. There's a pretty good evidence that the power of the presidency is mostly as a social contagion.
That makes sense.
That's what we're seeing now with Trump. The social contagion of his energy is pulling everything out, pulling all the shadow out. And Obama, especially for the African American community, and I've read lots of articles on this, I think we both have, on how that had impacted how African Americans perceive themselves. It cracked the glass ceiling. And then from that moment on, young African American children actually could perceive, they had an example of someone like them becoming president. And I think there was actually a study where prior to Obama, very few young African American kids in surveys mentioned they wanted to be president. But during the presidency and after, you get this big increase in them wanting to be president. So it really, and as soon as we have the first woman, female president, that'll be a big shift, So what we're talking about is these big collective shifts. So it's not easy to change things at that level. And like Jonathan was pointing out, it's like there were a lot of structural issues still in place that the segregation and the Voting Rights Act, it took a piece away, but it didn't get to the whole structural system. It just took a piece of it. It's so huge and so embedded in the system, even to the point of, I know Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was talking about that part of the Green New Deal. Huh?
Oh, just AOC.
AOC. What AOC said is part of what we're trying to do in the Green New Deal is make sure they don't fall into the same problem that the New Deal did, which is actually it had a structural prejudice against poor people.
And black people.
And black people.
Redlining built into
it only supported the development of white communities. It did not, and so so those are subtle things. Not so subtle, but those things are embedded in our system and in our collective field.
Mm.
And so in a way, the African American movement, if you look at it from this perspective, it's been a long road because of that, because it's not just about prejudiced people. It's about a system that has evolved from that prejudice to it's now running on automatic and enculturating us automatically. And how do we break that? How do we wake up to that?
Well, that's where we, having our own individual practice, obviously, and in our day, we start recognizing our unconscious reactions, and we start realizing it can start there. I'm not saying, that's going to change everything, but I definitely think that's a way that each of us can start, right?
Yes, we all have to start there. But right now, I have to say, right now we have to multitask. We have to get our feminine sides really in gear, because multitasking, according to Lynn Littman, is part of the feminine side of us.
I agree with her.
And so we have to do the inner work and the outer work simultaneously.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
We're in a game situation, and so the stakes are up.
Yes. But I think, what was so inspiring to me about Martin Luther is, as you said, his brilliance. He had the mind, but he had the heart, and he had the consciousness to, the connection to something greater, which helped in his intuition and to help guide him. So what an incredible inspiration for a human being to still struggle with the day-to-day, and yet, just show us what each of us are really capable of.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example.
Thank you, Mark. Is there anything more that you would like to add, or Jonathan or Sue? I know we're past our 1 hour mark, and I just have to say what a treat it is. Again, this is only our second conversation, but I really am going to look forward to the next Conscious Movie of the Month, because this is just everything I love. So thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. Thank everyone.
Thank you to everyone who participated this evening. Thanks for showing up.
Thank you.